St. Louis, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and a sound mind. Let me give you a little bit of an overview of what I'm intending to do. First of all, I would like to give you a little bit of an intro in terms of my motivation, what I'm doing, why I'm doing this. And then we'll have a tiny little warming up exercise to make sure you're all awake. And then I'll try to give you a little bit of my view on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, some more insights that you may not have if you live outside of Germany. Let's put it this way. And then my focus will be on presenting a little essay that he has written on stupidity. And that will lead us straight into a discussion, hopefully. So I hope it's more than just asking me questions, because I'm not a Bonhoeffer expert. I'm a Bonhoeffer fan. And therefore, I'm more interested in the discussion about what and how Bonhoeffer may inform our church as it is today. So let's start with the intentions and motivations for this little presentation. First of all, yes, I am working through my frustrations, because the General Conference in St. Louis has not just been a disappointment for me, but it actually has been a severe frustration. And let me just share with you why that is. First of all, the egocentricity. All we have been talking about basically has been about ourselves as a church. And I think that is a missed opportunity and was more than just disappointing. Secondly, the banality of many things. I mean, whether it's the Office of Archives and Statistics or whether it's Archive Statistics and Research, you don't need 2,000 delegates to come from all over the world to decide these kind of things. So that was disappointing and sometimes frustrating. But basically, or most important perhaps, this what you called, Lauren, disenfranchising and rather poor theology, that was infuriating at times for me. And if you want to put it in a more positive light, I think it was a missed opportunity. So I'm trying to grapple with all that, and hopefully what I'm talking or presenting about Bonhoeffer will help us in understanding and dealing with it. So I would like to introduce Dietrich Bonhoeffer to you. Now, Bonhoeffer is known to many, obviously. He is a well-known figure, but I think there's always more to be discovered. And I would like to present just a little bit Bonhoeffer, the man, the human being. Yes, the theologian as well. And primarily, I think of Bonhoeffer as a prophetic voice during the 20th century. What Bonhoeffer is as well, but we won't deal with it today, is he is a poet. He has written some very, very noteworthy poems, though only during the last couple of years, mainly when he was in prison. And he produced some very, very meaningful poetry, but that is always difficult with translation, obviously. Bonhoeffer is difficult enough to translate, even in prose, let alone poetry. And finally, last but not least, what my intention is not to rip apart the church or to say, look at Bonhoeffer and how wonderful, but I would like to encourage us. And the text that is in the back of my mind is from 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. And I've taken the King James version here, which I rarely use, but in this particular case, I do use it, because I like it here. I like the sound of it. For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Modern translations usually put self-discipline or something like that here. It's a very difficult Greek word, in fact, that is used in the original text. But a sound mind comes a little bit closer to what Bonhoeffer would have read in his German Luther Bible. So please keep this text in mind. I'll come back to it right at the end of the presentation. I will not expound on it too much, but this is kind of the guiding red thread that is in the back of my mind. So keep this text in mind during the presentation, but perhaps I might say also in your daily life, because I think it's a marvelous text that Paul wrote to Timothy. Rightio, let's start with a little warming up exercise, and I'll put a little, because you can use it easier when you see it on the chat function. You can click it directly. I've given you an email or address for your browser. If you just click on it and enter the code that is given there, I would like you to be active just quickly. Let's not spend a lot of time of it. Just put on 5 words or phrases that come to your mind when you hear the word Bonhoeffer. Okay, just click on that link, use this access code, and it should work. I tested it before. Just add 5 phrases or words that come to your mind when you hear Bonhoeffer. As a little warming up exercise, it will help me to get a little bit of an idea where I should not talk too much about, what I should not talk too much about, and where I should elaborate perhaps a little bit. Okay, I'll just give you a short moment before we look at the results. If you can't think of 5 things, just do 3. That's fine. This is not a test. It's not a quiz. You can't win anything. It's just for warming up and seeing how we are doing and what we know. What is our kind of what do you call that? Intelligently. I can't think of the word.
I just to interject here for a moment. Those of you who weren't quite sure of this, go to your chat, and Andreas Bochmann has placed the link there, and then you just copy and paste those 8 numbers, and this does take you to a different place in your computer. This takes you to a different page, and that's okay. You're not going to lose your place here. You're not going to be kicked out, but it's a way of, you'll find it very interesting. It's a way of gathering thoughts and putting them together. I've already placed mine there. And yeah, let me, Esther, let me repost the link here for you. Very, very interesting thing, Andreas. I don't think we've ever done anything like this before that takes people to another place and gives them a chance to create this thing that you're doing. I like it. Great idea.
I'm having fun because I can already see the results, and it's changing with each entry that is coming. 36 people have already entered something. Be daring, just try it. Just enter what comes to your mind. There's no right or wrong answer. Just give us an idea what comes to your mind when you hear Bonhoeffer. I'll stop at 50, but we are at 43 now. Perhaps there are a few more that would like to enter something.
Now, please understand, this will not work if you just enter it in the chat here. That's not, you have to actually go to a page that says Mentimeter.
Menti.com and the code, and you're there. Right, 52 people have answered, 53. You see it's changing constantly. And it's a word cloud, so you can see what the results are. Yeah, thank you for the hint. Don't put in the space when putting on the code. If you have difficulties, it may be because of the space in the code. It's just one long number. 37231365 is the number on menti.com. And you can see immediately a few words sticking out in the center: theologian, German, martyr. But there's a lot of other words that seem to be well-known: courageous, Christian. I did see the cost of discipleship. It's getting a little bit smaller, apparently. Yeah, there it is. And many tiny answers which didn't come up so often, like willing to kill Hitler, anti-Nazi, and one person even found him inspiring. Okay, let's stop here. We will make this available to you as well. I guess we can save it somehow, but I'll continue for now with the presentation. It gives me an idea. This needs to be small, and I'll continue with the presentation. And here you find a short summary of Bonhoeffer, a German Lutheran theologian, a pastor and a founding member of the Confessing Church. I'll talk about that a little bit later, and active part of the resistance against Hitler and the Nazi regime. The well-known books are The Cost of Discipleship, and the other small book that I highly recommend is Life Together, as well as the prison letters, which actually in German are called Widerstand und Ergebung, Resistance and Surrender. It's the German title of the prison letters. He was a profound thinker and a theologian. He is well respected, but I believe little understood. He remains an enigma. He is a kind of a riddle. Bonhoeffer was hanged in Flossenbürg on April 9, 1945, 3 weeks before the end of the Nazi regime. So that's just a quick wiki type summary of his life. I'll give you a little bit of a timeline, and with that timeline, I'll already add a little bit of some details which are interesting. He was born as child number 6 of 8 children, together with his twin sister Sabine. Now, his father, and that is interesting to me because I'm in the mental health field as well as a counselor. His father was a psychiatrist, so maybe not surprising he didn't do well in terms of psychology. He didn't like psychology too much. His mother was eine von Hase, so aristocracy. She was a teacher. Was born in 1906 and got his high school diploma with 17 years. Normally in Germany at that time, you got your Abitur with 19 years, but even as a high school kid, he was reading theologians and philosophers that I would never be able to understand, and wrote big essays about them. So he was an extremely brilliant mind. In 1927, so he was something like 23, 22, he got his doctorate, got his PhD. Some people get their BA at that time if they're quick, but he got his doctorate at that time. And with 24 years of age, he got his habilitation, as it is called in German, which basically is the entitlement for professorship. So it's like a second big, large PhD thesis you have to do in Germany, and he got that in 1929. So he was an extremely brilliant mind. And I think it helps to understand Bonhoeffer. The biggest books he wrote are the ones least known because nobody would understand them. Sanctorum Communio, his doctoral dissertation, and Akt und Sein, his habilitation. He also wrote a big work on ethics, and these 3 rather big books are the ones that are probably read the least. Now, in 1930, Bonhoeffer went to the US. He came to the US and had a fellowship at Union Theological Seminary in New York, which even at that time was one of the famous seminaries in the US. Already in 1933, he attacks Hitler in a radio address, and he was live on radio, and the radio address was interrupted and was stopped in the middle of it. 1933, that was just when Hitler had come to power, remember. So very early on, even before Hitler came to power, he severely criticized him and warned against Hitler. In 1937, he wrote The Cost of Discipleship, Nachfolge in German. And a year later, upon invitation, he joins the resistance against Hitler. His twin sister had a Jewish husband, so they fled to England, and he wrote the book Life Together. In 1939, he was invited back to the US, kind of to give him a safe haven, because he was not allowed to work as a pastor. He was not allowed to work as a teacher, as a professor in Germany. So there was some sort of understanding he is endangered in Germany. So they offered him a position at Union Theological Seminary. He went there and very quickly decided, no, he had to join the German people. He had to go back to Germany. Otherwise, he would be kind of inconsistent to his own faith. So he went back to Germany and used his ecumenical connections and used his official work for the military secret service of the Nazi regime to pass on information about what Hitler was doing actually, and was part of the resistance movement when Hitler was supposed to get killed, which we all know failed. And eventually they found out that he was part of that group that worked towards the assassination of Hitler. And he was imprisoned and eventually was executed in Flossenbürg. And that's where you have the book. I didn't put it in, actually, I just noticed, The Prison Letters. And that's the time where he wrote a lot of interesting poems. I thought rather than telling you all kinds of details, I'll give you a few pictures. This is a collage of Bonhoeffer pictures. My wife pointed out to me, yes, you had to put in the cigarette. Pointed out here on that picture. So maybe he would not have been a good Adventist, or I always like to call him the better Adventist, but that's certainly not because of the cigarette. But he was born into upper middle class family, and a cigarette once in a while was part of it. He was not a heavy smoker. On this picture, you see him with Eberhard Bethge. I'll come back to Eberhard Bethge a little bit later. You see him here as the little boy, and you see him here doing youth work with children and young people as a young pastor. But you may perhaps, pictures are very, tell us a lot more than sometimes text. And he is a very, how shall I put it, a very serious person, a deep thinker, very focused, very concentrated. And in fact, unfortunately, it must be stuck in one of my boxes. The best book to learn about Bonhoeffer is not Metaxa. The best book is one that basically consists of pictures. You learn all about the Nazi time, and all these pictures help to better understand what was going on. Let me just talk a little bit about his family, because I think that gives us a glimpse of his life and his time. His family was not very pious or religious. Now, his mother was a PK, was a pastor's kid, came from a more religious home. She prayed with the children regularly, but basically they were very mainstream Christians. So they went to church once a year at Christmas. That's kind of the German mainstream definition. They were upper middle class, had 8 children. That was quite normal at the time. They had enough money to take care of 8 children. They lived in a villa in Grunewald, which is the area for the well-to-do people in Berlin. That's actually the villa they lived in. That was their main residence. And they also had a summer residence in the Harz area. You see it here. Today it is a little cafe, but that's the house where they spent their summer vacation. Very typical for that time, that you had a house in Berlin or wherever you worked, and then you had a summer residence which looked quite kind of almost as big as the main residence. Now, you found a lot of music in their home. There was music, in-house concerts, and a lot of hospitality. So people were invited to come to a little house concert. I mean, that was before the time where everybody had a radio, let alone TV. TV wasn't invented, and radio, well, wasn't really in use in those days. So you met at home. Here you see, perhaps you can recognize it, a grand piano. That's their music and living room, and lots of people came and went, and the Bonhoeffer family had a lot of socializing going on. Now, when Bonhoeffer told his family that he intended to study theology, they were actually quite shocked. They were extremely shocked and thought, why in the world? Law would have been a good solution. You know, that's why I, as a pastor, I'm glad my son decided for law rather than theology. So they had hoped for a lawyer or an engineer, but he decided to go into theology. Eventually, they were fine with it, but basically, as they were not very religious, it wasn't all that meaningful to them. Let me just give you a picture of his work. He has published many, many books, and you see here an edition, an historic critical edition of his works, 18 books in all. So considering that he died with 39 years, that's quite a lot, I would say. Perhaps I could also introduce him as a sojourner. Bonhoeffer has not just lived in Germany. What people often don't know, he lived in Barcelona from 28 to 29. That's where he did his internship. He went to Spain, to the Lutheran church there, German community, and did his internship. And during that time, he wrote the following words, which I find interesting and telling. My theology is starting to become humanistic. What's the point? Wondering whether Barth was ever abroad. So he puts a connection between his theology turning more humanistic, and Barth apparently was not humanistic in his view. So he wondered whether Barth was abroad. New York, that's interesting. I didn't mention it before, but he went to New York in 1930 for the fellowship at Union, because he was too young to be ordained. He had all the qualifications to be a professor, because he had his doctorate, he had his habilitation, but he was too young to be ordained in the church. So he put in a kind of a gap year in New York as a fellow at Union Seminary, Theological Seminary, and there he had many friendships, and for more than 6 months, I have been in one of the large Negro Baptist churches in Harlem almost every Sunday. I have heard the gospel preached in those Negro churches, he wrote. Now that's interesting, because at Union Theological Seminary, there was a very, very well-known homiletic teacher who preached every Sunday and was very elaborate and very good with words and very sophisticated. But Bonhoeffer was bored stiff and thought, this is not the gospel, this is not really meaningful to me. So a friend invited him downtown to Harlem, and he went into a black church, and he enjoyed, you know, this intellectual, brilliant mind, all cognitive, all up here. But he thoroughly enjoyed black preaching and the black music, the spirituals and jazz were something that he thoroughly enjoyed. He also spent some time in London, 33 to 35. After Hitler got into power, he stayed in London and was a pastor of the German Lutheran Church there. And that's where he had many ecumenical connections, and he helped the Confessing Church in Germany with his connections. I'll come back to the Confessing Church in a moment. And he writes in London, I've been here for 8 days, have to preach every Sunday and receive news from Berlin about the state of affairs almost every day. It almost tears you apart inside, he writes. So very early on, not just before the Second World War, but very early on in Hitler's career, he is seeing with a prophetic clarity where Germany is heading. Let me give you a few names in terms of who has been influencing him. In 1930, when he was in America for the first time, he was listening and reading Niebuhr a lot, Reinhold Niebuhr, the theologian that is associated with the social gospel. Many of you will know him. In Germany, Niebuhr is known by name, but less what he stands for, Martin Niemöller is a German theologian. He was one of the main founders of the Confessing Church, about which I'll talk about a little later. Karl Barth, obviously everybody knows, at least by name, a Reformed theologian, not a Lutheran, a Reformed theologian. And may I add that Bonhoeffer always was kind of in a clinch with Karl Barth. It was a friendship that was very difficult, let's put it this way. So he was not always happy with Karl Barth, nor was Barth happy with Bonhoeffer, but they kept very close contact. I tried to find a picture where Barth was a little bit younger. That's the younger Barth, actually. We usually see pictures where he's a little bit older. Now, one of the stories I'm not going into because that would be a presentation of its own is that when he went to prison, he just had previously got engaged to Maria von Wedemeyer. He was like 38 when he went into prison, and Maria von Wedemeyer was one of his students, actually, and she was half his age. And that raises a lot of questions. She was 16 when they kind of started to get friends, and I think she was 18 when she got engaged to him while he was 36 or something like that. So weird story, but there's a book with the love letters that these two exchanged, and I've read that. It's a fascinating reading, and it's easy to say, oh, well, he becomes a kind of father figure for her, and this is unhealthy to have such a young girl with such a mature man who has been traveling all over the world. Well, when I read the love letters, I changed my mind a little bit, but there are still issues, there are still questions that I have about this relationship. And Maria von Wedemeyer survived Bonhoeffer and lived to an old age, but she was always kind of influenced in all her life by Bonhoeffer, and it has been, from my perspective, a rather tragic life. But I think she has been an inspiration to him, and some of the poems that he wrote were written for her. Eberhard Bethge, I mentioned him before. He is one of the biographers of Bonhoeffer. He was a very, very close friend of Bonhoeffer's, and has been one of the main interpreters of who Bonhoeffer really was. Right, let me come to the Confessing Church. I'll give you just bits and pieces. There's no systematics in what I'm doing here. My intention is to get you curious, and perhaps you want to read more about Bonhoeffer, or if you don't like reading, I might add, I wanted to put it in, I forgot it in the end. There is a wonderful movie which basically I think is very accurate in portraying Bonhoeffer's life. Bonhoeffer, Agent of Grace is the English title, where you have a German actor actually playing Bonhoeffer, but he does extremely well, I think. And they can learn about Bonhoeffer's life because the movie basically just uses original quotes from Bonhoeffer in the dialogues. Now, the Confessing Church, Martin Niemöller, I mentioned already. Niemöller survived the Nazi regime, and in 1976, he made the following statement, and I think you have heard this one before, and it gives us an idea of what the Confessing Church was all about. He says, when the Nazis took the communists, I kept silent. After all, I was not a communist. When the Nazis locked up the Social Democrats, I kept silent. I was not a Social Democrat. When they took the trade unionists, I kept silent. After all, I was not a trade unionist. When they took me, there was no one left to protest. Basically, the Confessing Church was forming as an alternative to what was called the German Christians, a very Nazi Lutheran church, on two accounts. One was the area paragraph. That was a law about excluding all those who were Jews or not of an Aryan origin from the church. And the German church, the German Christians, were very willing to do that. And the Confessing Church said, no, we need to remain inclusive. And the other issue becomes very clear in the Barman Declaration. And Barman Declaration is something I highly recommend that you Google it and read up on it, because I think it is a statement where I oftentimes think, and I'll come to that in the discussion perhaps, we as a church need a Barman Declaration as well these days. Basically, the Barman Declaration was an answer to the personality cult that was developing around Hitler. So they had 6 theses in this Barman Declaration. I took the summary from Wiki and adjusted it a little bit here and there, but basically you get the idea. It says the only source of revelation is the word of God, Jesus Christ, the living word. And look at the next one. Jesus Christ is the only Lord of all aspects of personal life. And it talks about justification and sanctification. Very interesting in terms of theology. Long story about it, would lead too far here. The church is a fellowship of brothers and sisters. I added and sisters in those days. They were talking about brothers, but meant brothers and sisters. Message and order of the church is not to be influenced by current worldviews or political convictions. Now, you may want to discuss this, but it is very interesting. This was a document of opposition. You need to understand that. Offices in the church do not establish dominion of some leaders over others. But the word that they used, and the wording was very, very carefully, there were several drafts before that, they actually used the word Führer here in the plural. And Führer, of course, was Adolf Hitler. So it was a direct attack against Adolf Hitler. The state, they suggested, the state cannot fulfill the task of the church or vice versa. So the state has a certain role and the church has a certain role, and they should not mix, they should stay separate. And in fact, they feared, or they observed, that the state tried to take over responsibilities that really were the church's responsibility. And it very strongly rejects the subordination of the church to the state and the subordination of the word and spirit to the church. You need to read up all on it if you want to go into detail, but that's what where Bonhoeffer was very, very much involved, and Karl Barth, Bonhoeffer, Niemöller were the main names that are remembered. Now, I suggested that Bonhoeffer is the better Adventist. And I'll show you one famous quote that I like particularly to prove my point. He often thought and reflected on the end of the world. And he says in one place, it may well be that the world will end tomorrow, but only then will we lay down our labor for a better world, not before. And this rings in my ears why I'm saying the better Adventist, because in the Adventist church, you often find the position, why should we get involved in protecting the environment? Why should we get involved in social justice issues? And Bonhoeffer says that's his approach, very close to Luther's apple tree that Luther has never mentioned. It's a later fabrication, but very similar to that. He says, no, we have to work for social justice. We have to take care of this world. We have to labor for a better world, even though he may come tomorrow. It may end tomorrow, the world, but we only put down our work when Jesus actually is there and has come. So that's my main argument why I suggest he's the better Adventist. Another famous quote, and that's from The Cost of Discipleship, cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ, living and incarnate. I think this is a wonderful statement, and even as Adventist, even as conservative Adventist, I think you could agree with this particular statement. And if you want to read more, get The Cost of Discipleship, because the whole chapter is just absolutely fascinating. But this is where you get the term cheap grace from. It is a phrase coined by Bonhoeffer. It's often used, but if you really want to understand it, read The Cost of Discipleship. Okay, now let's come to the General Conference. When I was at the General Conference, one of my friends and colleagues, a conference president from Germany, who will remain unnamed here, he reminded me of a little essay by Bonhoeffer, which I had read before, but I hadn't made the link to the General Conference. He made that link and made me aware, so I read that little essay again. Maybe some of you have read it, but I would like to present a few pieces of it if you want to read along. Otherwise, you have to wait for the video, then you can stop it and have more time to read, or you find it on the internet. I'll just read to you the highlighted bits that hopefully will lead into a discussion. This was actually written while Bonhoeffer was imprisoned in Berlin-Tegel, and you see the Berlin-Tegel prison on these pictures, and you see Bonhoeffer right next to one of the guards right here. That's Bonhoeffer, and that's, I think, an Italian fellow prisoner. And while he was in prison, actually, he did a lot of pastoral care for his fellow prisoners. But he also observed what was going on outside the prison walls and wrote down his thoughts. And this was in one of his prison letters, a little essay. Stupidity, he says, is more dangerous enemy of the good than malice. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. Neither protests nor the use of force accomplishes anything here. Reasons fall on deaf ears. Facts that contradicts one's prejudgment simply need not be believed. In such moments, the stupid person even becomes critical, and when facts are irrefutable, they are just pushed aside as inconsequential, as accidental. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read these lines, I had a lot of thoughts about recent Adventist history and about the General Conference. It sounded almost prophetic. In all this, the stupid person, in contrast to the malicious one, is utterly self-satisfied. And so he concludes here, never again will we try to persuade the stupid person with reasons, for it is senseless and dangerous. Now, this is already a way towards a solution. He also said, it is in essence not an intellectual defect, but a human one. In other words, it's not a matter of stupid in terms of being low in intelligence. It is something else. It's a human failure. Upon closer observation, it becomes apparent that every strong upsurge of power in the public sphere, be it of political or a religious nature, infects a large part of humankind with stupidity. Oh, well. If this rings any bells with you, fine. It did ring a lot of bells with me. And again, I find that Bonhoeffer has had a prophetic view in so many things with a clarity that is an example to me. The fact that the stupid person is often stubborn must not blind us to the fact that he is not independent. In conversation with him, one virtually feels that one is dealing not at all with a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like that have taken possession of him. He's under a spell, blinded, misused, and abused in his very being. St. Louis was full of slogans and catchphrases, which to me appeared rather hollow and empty. But they have taken kind of possession of people. I find this very, very telling. Having thus become a mindless tool, the stupid person will also be capable of any evil, at the same time incapable of seeing that it is evil. So there is a well-intentioned evil. This is harsh. This is not what I'm saying. You know, I'm glad Bonhoeffer is saying, so I don't need to say that, but I think it reflects on some of the things we experience in our church. Yet at this very point, it becomes quite clear that only an act of liberation, not instruction, can overcome stupidity. Here we must come to terms with the fact that in most cases, a genuine internal liberation becomes possible only when external liberation has preceded it. This is something where I have to ponder, and I'm not quite sure whether this doesn't sort of contradict what he's saying later on in the essay, but maybe we can discuss that. The word of the Bible, that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, declares that the internal liberation of human beings to live the responsible life before God is the only genuine way to overcome stupidity. Something to ponder. But these thoughts about stupidity also offer consolation in that they utterly forbid us to consider the majority of people to be stupid in every circumstance. It really will depend on whether those in power expect more from people's stupidity than from their inner independence and wisdom. That's the end of the essay. It goes on a tiny little bit, but I'll leave it at that. And from there, I would like to come to some kind of a discussion with you, and would like to offer you a few theses that may guide us in the discussion. Perhaps we go somewhere else completely. Maybe you have completely different questions and want to know a lot more about Bonhoeffer that I might not be able even to answer you. But my first thesis would be the crisis of St. Louis is one of stupidity, not malice. I believe that all those people who have presenting and have given talks and have preached in St. Louis are well-meaning, serious Christians. They don't mean harm, they mean good for the church. But the real issue is the stupidity. I'm not talking intelligence. I'm not saying you are stupid in the sense of you don't have any intelligence, but in the sense Bonhoeffer uses the term. Second thesis, the answer is not instruction, if I follow Bonhoeffer, but an act of liberation. And of course, I wonder what might that mean in concrete terms. I'm struggling with that. I don't have an answer to that. Don't expect that I can give you an answer here. But what would be an act of liberation rather than instruction? You know, we as Adventists are always good with instruction, but no, that's not what is required. According to this thesis I'm presenting here from Bonhoeffer, and you may disagree, of course. Expecting more from inner independence and wisdom, term by Bonhoeffer, used by Bonhoeffer, we must cultivate exactly that and preach and teach and live a Christianity, or an Adventism, if you want, come of age. An Adventism, a Christianity come of age, means it is with independence and wisdom, rather than being dependent on traditions, Ellen White, whatever you put in there. And coming back to the confessing church, I would like to add every personality and celebrity cult is to be countered with a strong Christology. I think the focus needs to be on Christ and Christ alone. And in fact, Bonhoeffer has a very, very strong Christology, and everything in his theological writings is somehow connected to his Christology. And only when you understand his history, when you understand his biography, you understand why he puts so much emphasis on Christology in everything he writes. These are my theses. Before we start the discussion, let me add a little postlude. I said I would come back to it. Sometimes in the 90s, my wife and I, my late wife and I, we went to Austria, I think it was, and kind of took the wrong turn and ended up, it wasn't planned, ended up in Flossenbürg. Stayed there overnight, and on Sabbath morning we went to the concentration camp of Flossenbürg and looked at the place where Bonhoeffer spent his last few days before he was executed. And in fact, saw this wall that you see on this picture. And we stood there in the sunshine. I took a picture very similar to this one, but this one is a little bit clearer to read. You find the names listed here of all those who were executed. And here Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the pastor, is mentioned. We stood there on that place, and in that cross, difficult to see, in that cross, at this wall where he was executed, you find a text. you find a text, 2 Timothy 1, verse 7. And I have to admit, in those days, I did not know what was written there. So I took out my little Bible that I always have with me, and I read the text aloud. Remember, it was a Sabbath. There wasn't a church nearby. This was our church service. And I read this text in 2 Timothy 1, verse 7, and I have to admit that tears were running down my cheeks. For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind.